Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Emily, the program coordinator for Keep Pearland Beautiful. Thanks for joining us for our monthly garden lecture tonight. We upload all of our past garden lectures on our website, which is pearlandrecycles.com, and on our YouTube channel. Please be sure to take the survey once you complete the lecture tonight. I will have the survey pinned in the comments and in the live description. Feel free to ask any questions you might have in the comments. We will have time to answer your questions at the end or as the presentation flows. I'm going to pass it over to Nick and Andra for their presentations.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Winter Care for Fruit Trees along the Texas Gulf Coast. I'm Andra Howland, and our co-presenter tonight is Nick Falstead. If you have any questions, just like Emily mentioned, enter them into the chat. Nick and I are Brazoria County Master Gardeners. And tonight we're going to cover winter care for fruit trees along the Texas Gulf Coast. We're going to talk about freeze protection, fertilizing, pruning, and spraying of 4 different types of trees, being citrus, avocado, peaches, and pears. Okay. And now I'm going to turn this over to Nick, and he is going to talk about protecting citrus from freezes.
Bring a document. Take a second to come up. And hey, can you see the screen?
You can see the screen.
Okay, this is what I call a Texas Christmas tree. But it's a grapefruit tree here in Texas with all the little light bulbs on it. These are just grapefruit. Anyway, we love our citrus, and I'm going to start us off today talking about freeze protecting our citrus trees. You may all be aware that in the 2021 and 2022, we had serious, severe freezes in this area that killed many of the citrus trees in Brazoria County. My estimation is that 95% of the citrus trees in Brazoria County were killed during those 2 freezes. The question is, how can we stop this from happening? How can we keep from losing 95% of our fruit trees during a serious storm? Do we have to stop growing them in order to not lose our trees? That's what today is all about. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about just general about orchards and growing fruit trees. When we think about growing fruit trees, this is what I typically think of. These nice long rows of beautifully cared for, immaculate trees that look exactly alike. Well, in reality, this is more what we get. We get all sorts of, now there are true fruit orchards that are like that, the professionally well done ones with experts that know what they're doing. But this is more what we tend to get with fruit trees of different sizes. Some have completely died and growing in a backyard or something like that. That's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect to have a wonderful tree. You might notice that this is one of those fruit trees. It happens to be another grapefruit tree that has fruit on it. It's doing really well. Let's talk about Brazoria County. On average, in Brazoria County, we get about 52 inches of rain a year. That's a lot of rain. We have challenging soils, typically clay and a loam that has very low permeability. This is important because if you can't get the water to your roots, they don't do as well. So that is a challenge. However, it's also a positive. This soil, while it has low water permeability, is very highly productive when you do get the drainage right. And so it can be very good soil, even though it has some disadvantages. You may have heard of the climate zones. The USDA climate zones for Brazoria County are Zone A, 9A, and 9B. 9A is the northern portion of the county. The temperatures get down typically to 20 to 25 degrees. 9B is along the coast, and those temperatures are a little bit moderate. The lowest lows tend to be more in the 35 to 30s in this region. Okay, the typical last date for a freeze is around February 15th, but anyone who knows 2021 and 2022 knows that we had, at least in 2021, had a severe freeze about February 19th, and it lasted, I don't remember, but several days. So you have to watch this weather. We're going to talk a little bit about chill hours. This is the cumulative hours between 45 degrees F and 32 degrees F during a winter. You add those up and it's called the chill hours for a given area. This is important for your stone fruit, your peaches, and some of these trees. You need to know the chill hours. If you plant a tree that requires 900 chill hours, and there are some that do, and you only get 200 chill hours, that tree won't put on fruit. So it's something to be aware of. Hopefully we'll talk about that. So my main area of emphasis today, before I turn it back over to Andra, is how do you protect citrus trees from freezing? Can you protect them from freezing? Can you eliminate freezing for your citrus trees? Well, let's start off with a couple questions. Do citrus trees die in a light freeze? Well, the answer is typically not. There's always going to be variability. And I will take an aside here and say, if you asked 25 gardeners the same gardening question, how many responses that are different will you get? And the answer is, if you have 25 gardeners the same question, you'll probably end up with 26 different answers. There's a lot of differences of opinion, and that's okay. I don't have to think the same as everyone else in order to be useful and helpful, and in order to garden well. So just be aware that there's differences of opinions on all of these things. And while somebody else may tell you something a little bit different, just take it in stride and understand that these are our best guidelines that we're giving you from a lot of experience. So, do citrus trees die in a light freeze? Typically not. They typically will do okay down to about 26 degrees Fahrenheit, most citrus trees. Not all, but almost all of them will do well. What about citrus trees in a hard freeze? Say you get down to 20 degrees F for more than 24 hours. That's generally considered to be a hard freeze. In that situation, many of your citrus trees, but not all, will die in that situation. Okay, so what can we do about it? Can we protect them? The answer is an emphatic yes. We can do a lot to protect them from freezing. Just to let you know, when I was going through the freezes of 2021 and 2022, I think over both freezes and my orchard of 15 to 20 trees, I lost 3 over both freezes. So roughly 90% of my trees survived those freezes, and other people were successful as well. So what should we do? We can do nothing, cover and add tarps. These are typical suggestions. We could add heat lamps or Christmas lights. We could mulch them. We could spray water on them, or we could do a combination of the above. So what works? That's what today is all about. I'm going to give you the summary because I want you to be able to see this, and then as we are talking, more of this will make sense to you. It's my recommendations for various different approaches are adding a heat source and a cover. You can add just mulch, and you'll understand a little bit better as we go through this presentation when you might do one and when you might do another. You could do a heat source, a tarp, and mulch all together. And then you can try mulching everything. And as I say, we'll see where some of these will apply as we go through the presentation. So let's get started. All right, there's 2 different main approaches to saving citrus trees in a freeze. First, you can save the graft from dying, and we'll talk about exactly what a graft is in just 1 second. Okay, that saves the tree so that the next year the same tree comes back. If the graft dies, you won't get a tree that resembles the tree that you had. The second approach is keeping the trunk, the branches, and the leaves from dying. Okay, so let's try and understand. If you want to save the tree, you need to save the graft. In a serious freeze, this is my focus, saving the graft. In a light freeze, say it gets down to 30 degrees Fahrenheit one day, then I am going to be looking at trying to save the trunk, the branches, the leaves, and in short, trying to keep that tree so it still creates wonderful fruit the next year. So it really depends on how hard the freeze is. In a serious freeze, I'm going to want to save the graft and I'm not going to worry about if I lose the next year's crop. In a light freeze, I'm going to try and save everything. All right, so let's talk about this graft. I mentioned that just a second ago. What is this graft that's so important? In our area, the rootstock is very important. We recommend Trifoliata rootstock that has high salinity resistance, has a certain degree of freeze resistance, and is also disease resistant. Very good rootstock for this area, which tends to have problems with all three of those areas. So the graft is the point where you take the new material and the new citrus tree and you graft it onto the roots of a trifoliata, which happens to have the resistance we need in this area. Well, let's talk a little bit about exactly what that means. I'm just moving these over here for a second. So here's an example tree coming out of my own orchard. You can see the roots down here. I uncovered the roots a little. You can see the trunk here, and then you can see the branches going up. This tree's probably 3 or 4 years old. So where's the graft point? What you're looking for is a change in the bark from one kind of bark to another. You can see there's almost this little line right here. You can make an argument that's a graft point. You can see the same thing. See how it's going from this greenish color to a much grayer area? You could also make another one about argument about this area, how it's going from one type of bark to a different type of bark. And you could also make an argument here. Well, it turns out that this is where the graft point is. These areas up by the branches, those are collars. They put, when a tree has a branch, it has a slightly different type of cell structure where it attaches to the trunk. So it's not typically where the branches are attaching. It's typically where you go from one style of or color or shade of a tree, of a trunk, to another. All right, let's look at another example. Here's another example. Look at this and see if you can find the graft point where we're going for one color or shade or grain of the trunk to another. And you can see that right up here, we're going from these very line-filled grain to a much different, almost circular type grain. Here's your graft point. Much easier on that one. Here's another one, a little bit challenging. And don't feel bad if it's hard to get it right the first time. We could start up here. Well, we know that right where the branches connect, there's changes, but that's not the graft point. Well, you come down here, you could argue, but you see these lines, they're all pretty much the same above and below. Okay, so that may not be it. If we start working down the branch, it's still very similar, Get to this point, look at this. See how the colors change? See how there's almost a line across here? There's your graft point. Not only does the grain change, the color changes, it turns out in this case. So this is your graft. You save the wood right around that graft point, and you're going to save the tree. Everything else could die from maybe an inch on up, from an inch above the graft point on up, and that tree will come back as the original tree. If you allow it to die below that graft point, you've lost that tree, whatever it was. And now you have just the rootstock, which in this area, the rootstock does not produce useful fruit. Okay. All right. So that's what we're trying to do in order to save the tree. Now, if we can save the trunk, the branches, and the leaves, we're going to do that. But if it's a serious enough freeze, that's what we want to save. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the approaches. The first approach is the easiest. It's do nothing. Super simple. No effort is required. The deltas is that isn't always very effective. You can sometimes lose your fruit. Sometimes you can lose the whole tree by doing nothing. Okay, let's talk about a different approach. This is one that we saw in the summary, adding heat and then covering the plant. This is done by many people. You can add heat and insulation that can protect against a long freeze or a severe freeze. It raises the lowest temperature that a plant's going to experience. So in theory, you can also use this on trees, but also other plants. Minuses or deltas, the effectiveness varies. The challenge here is at quantifying how much heat you're adding and how effective your insulation is. It's a little bit of a guess in the dark. It's a better guess than doing nothing, for sure, but it's not always clear if you've done the right amount. There's another challenge. It involves some danger. And I'm not trying to be overly dramatic, but we need to recognize that anytime we're adding a heating source, there is a danger involved. You must pick heating devices carefully. I'm going to repeat that. You must pick heating devices carefully. They must be weather acceptable, or they could, and you even being weather acceptable, they may burn the tree, they may burn the mulch, or you could conceivably even burn your home, because a heat lamp in a confined space could be serious. Heaters can char or roast a plant. I have done that. I'm just telling you, it does happen if you're not careful. And when you cover a tree, you may overheat the tree after the freeze. Let me explain this one. When you have a cover over a tree, especially if it's a clear plastic cover, you've effectively created a greenhouse. That greenhouse will overheat. If after a freeze, the temperatures come up, that's going to bring the temperatures inside of that covering up. And then if the sun beats on it, you could have freezing one night and 80 degrees the next. And if the temperatures happen to rise to, say, 50, 60, 70, or even 80 degrees, then inside that covered plant, you may be 100, 110, and 120 degrees. And I have done that. I learn a lot, my best lessons by my mistakes. So we need to be careful. This is still a good technique. You just have to be careful. Okay, let's look at an example of what this is. I'm very hands-on. I want to see what we're talking about. Well, here we have a tree. We've added a heat source, in this case, some incandescent Christmas lights. We added a cover. That's simple. Okay, here's another tree. Here's a different type of heating source. Heat lamps, I warn you, can overheat. So be careful. Make sure there's plenty of space. This is too close to a branch, the way this picture is drawn, but we're assuming that you're not going to do that. And then you put a cover over it. And this I've done. Here's an example of what I've done in one of the orchards that I manage. This is at the food pantry, Food Basket Food Pantry. And here you see a heat lamp. It turns out was in here and covered up well. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at another aspect. I mentioned that there's a variability with this technique. What about the heating sources? I mean, aren't heating sources all the same? In 2022, I used several different types of of heat lamps and also Christmas lights. And I found that not all the bulbs worked the same. In 2023, before I put them back out, I said, I'm going to test these and find out. Well, one of them gave absolutely no heat. Here you see the temperature rise 9 inches from the heat bulb. And here's just time in minutes. And the first one, labeled as a warm light, in 4 minutes gave me 0 increase in temperature. It turns out warm is actually a quality of the light. It's the type of light that's put out. It has nothing to do with the temperature. This was an LED that generated absolutely 0 temperature rise inside of that cover. The second one was an IR lamp. This did not generate any light, but it did generate heat. And you can see there was modest heat rise with this one. The next one was a 250 watt heat lamp. And you can see we saw a very rapid temperature rise inside in this test that we did. And the last one was the same, but only had a higher temperature rise. More temperature is not necessarily better. This type of a bulb that's generating 30 degrees, 9 inches from the heat source, can quickly get to be too much. So you've got to be careful and know how much heat you're actually putting in. Okay, want to take a look at continuously watering. This is something that's been done by commercial growers. And I'm going to let Andra talk about this particular technique.
During the 2021 freeze, we had 2 citrus trees, mature citrus trees. And we didn't have a lot of the options that Nick has presented, but we did have a sprayer. And we thought, well, commercial growers do this. And we aimed our sprayer on our lemon tree. And needless to say, we met with abject failure with this method, because even though we were in city limits and we had a supply of water, we had no water pressure because everyone was letting their faucets drip. And as a result, we just got a little bit of the canopy with ice on it, and we did not get the ice on the graft, which is where we needed to. The other tree, our grapefruit tree, received no water whatsoever, and it froze. One other thing that you may take into consideration is if you are in a rural area where you have your own water supply, but you have a well and a pump on that well. If you lose power, you're going to lose the ability also to protect that tree. And one of the things that you need to remember is that the tree is protected from ice. When the water hits the tree, it freezes and there is heat given off in that process. So if you quit spraying the tree with water, your tree is going to freeze. So it's very important that, number one, you have water pressure, and number two, you have power. So I'm going to turn this back over to Nick, and he'll keep presenting.
So the concept, just as Andra explained it, is that as the water hits the tree and freezes on the tree, it gives up heat, which keeps the tree from freezing inside of the tree, and that keeps the tree alive. However, if you stop, as she mentioned, if you stop for any reason adding water, that freezing process stops, and then the tree it goes to the temperature of the ice that's covering it, and it dies. So this is used by commercial growers. It does work, but getting the addition amounts right can be tough. And so it's something you want to be careful with and make sure you get it right. Okay. Continuous water addition can be a good technique. Okay, let's talk about another technique, mulching trees. Okay, the pluses here is this can be a very effective way of protecting the graft, but not the branches and the leaves, etc. The challenge is just that the leaves and the branch may still die. Okay, let's look at an example here. Very simple. Mulch to the bottom of the tree and you protect the graft. Here is one of the trees in my orchard. This was the before, and here's after. Just going to move this up so we can see that a little better. Okay, and here's the after. Very simple, really. And now the graft is well protected. Okay, variation number 2. Here, you're adding dirt and not mulch to the base of the tree. Now, you might say, well, what does it matter if I'm adding mulch or dirt? It's important first to add the dirt, and then second, that there's no other material, such as plants, such as weeds, such as mulch, or anything else that may insulate between the ground and the dirt. Okay, let me explain. Okay, the earth transmits energy, heat from the earth to the tree. The earth in our freezes almost always is much warmer than the air outside. The air changes rapidly. The earth's temperature changes only very slowly. In zone 9A, 9B, the earth is usually still quite warm during a freeze. The problem with this technique, just like the last one, is the leaves and the branches may still freeze. And lastly, I haven't tested this one extensively, but it should work well in principle, and I have used it. Now let's have a look at this. I said, is this real? What is the temperature of the Earth on a freeze day? Well, I went out and measured it last year. I said, I want to know. So this is the temperature thermometer of a soil thermometer. So it's down in the ground 3 or 4 inches, and you can see that on January 22nd at 8 a.m., it was reading 50 degrees. At that same time, using this probe and this temperature measurement device, the air temperature was 34 degrees. 16 degrees in difference in temperature. That's what we're talking about. So the earth really just radiates that temperature up through the earth. Now, if you have a bunch of grass here or mulch or something, that's going to insulate it. And it's not going to radiate from the earth up through the dirt nearly as effectively. So adding dirt instead of mulch can be a very effective technique. Can work well. And third, this is another mulch variation. This can be very, very effective. It can protect even the very sensitive plants and trees, protects the grafts. This technique is to bury the whole tree. And I'll show you exactly how we go about that. It protects the grass, the trunks, and the leaves. Works great on small trees, but even can be used around the base of a medium or a large tree. Now, the challenge is that it requires additional materials, fencing, weed barrier, and requires much more mulch and dirt. Let's look at it. Here's our tree. And here, this is shown for a large tree. We've put a little fence around this tree and about 3 feet up the trunk, added a little layer of mulch, a little weed barrier, so it just doesn't come out of the holes of the fence, and added mulch. That's simple. I'll show you another example. Here we have a tree. We were about to have a freeze, so we want to protect it. Here's our wonderful assistant, Lisa Woods, and you can see what it looked like when she wrapped that weed barrier and fencing around this little tree, and we filled it with mulch. We had a tree last year that had blooms all over it. It was a Meyer lemon, as I recall, and it was covered with blooms because it really blooms early. And we were about to get a freeze, and that freeze would have killed every one of those blooms. 2 days later, when I unwrapped that, those blooms were all just doing great. And there's fruit on that tree today because of it. So it can be really effective. Okay, so what about combining methods? What about combining mulching with a heat and cover? Okay, this can be a really effective technique. Protects the graft, but also the trunk and the leaves. Can be used on small and intermediate. However, when it comes to a large tree, it's hard to cover a really large tree with any cover that's meaningful. This does involve danger of overheating, as I said before. Anytime you've got a heating source and a cover, you must be careful. I didn't say don't do it, but be careful. Weather acceptable. You could burn the mulch, you could burn a tarp, or even your home. So just be careful. use wisdom in how you implement that. That's why I tend to like the Christmas lights, because they're not nearly as likely to have high heat in one focused area. Okay. Effective heating devices can char and roast a plant, as I mentioned, and the covers can still overheat when the sun comes out. So be wise about how you do it. Let's look at this technique. Here is a tree. We've added mulch, added some heating source, and covered. Simple as that. Here we've taken another one, added another heating source, and covered. And here's an example where we've done this. All right. What really works? We've talked about all these different methods, and I'm going to spend just a couple last slides trying to put them in perspective. What really works? We have a project at the Orchard Committee for Master Gardeners called Project Polar Freeze. And in this project, we said, okay, let's look at 2021 freeze and 2022 freeze, these really hard freezes. What protected those trees in a severe freeze? Well, doing nothing was the least effective. The survival rate was reported to be 5%. I have my doubts that things survived when somebody did nothing, but there are some trees that are very, very well or resistant. So that certainly is possible to be accurate. When people added a cover and just added heat, the survival rate was about 30% of the trees, 70% mortality rate. When they did spraying with water, this is a very soft number. I've listed it. It's soft. We had just two people reporting in, so we don't really know how well it worked. But some died and some didn't, right, based on the data. And lastly, those that mulched, heated, and covered had 90% of the trees survived in those serious freezes. That's a huge number. Okay, so let's talk about when you do one thing and when you might do something else. Protecting your citrus in a freeze. I recommend that even if it's getting down to 31 degrees, just barely dipping into freezing, I recommend you protect your trees. Don't let a minor frost kill all the limbs and leaves. That's my recommendation. They probably would survive it if you did nothing in that situation, but I recommend you protect your trees. I use a two-tiered approach. If the temperature is, say, between 26 and 32 degrees, heating and cover will protect the trees, the limbs, the leaves pretty well. If, however, the temperature is getting to be less than 26 degrees, you want to use something that's going to focus on the graft point. You want to keep that tree alive. If you lose the branches, I'm not so worried about it at that point. I'm worried about losing the graft and not having that tree anymore. So that's when you use mulch or soil with a heating source and cover, or just burying the tree or the trunk completely. Again, if the tree temperature is between 26 and 32 degrees F, something like heat and cover would be fine. If the temperature is likely to be less than 26 degrees, mulching with soil and heating source and covering, or burying the tree would probably be the best approach. All right, here's our recommendations. This shows mulch, heat source, and a tarp. And one thing I will comment about this is about 3 feet across. This is too small an area to put a heat lamp in there, because you're going to have that heat lamp too close to the tree itself. So you want to do that when you have more room. This would be great for Christmas lights or something like that. Okay, here's your second recommendation. Here we've completely covered a small tree, and that will make it through 20 degrees for a week. It will protect that tree for a long period of time. All right. In summary, so you have a light freeze coming. You want to do something. Well, adding a gentle heat source and a tarp will probably be great. Say you have a much more serious freeze coming. Say you're going to get down to 20 degrees overnight. Well, then you're going to want to protect at least the graft point with as much mulch as you can, or dirt. Dirt's even better, but protect that with a mulch approach. You may lose branches and leaves, but at least you protected the graft point. Say you have one of those serious freezes down to 20 degrees overnight. Well, maybe you'll want to go ahead and add the mulch like we did before, but then go ahead and add some lights to give it a little heating source and cover. This will definitely protect you very well during a serious freeze. And the best approach, in my opinion, in a serious freeze is to use the mulch completely, the fence and mulch. Mulch everything. If it's a small tree, that really works well. If it's a large tree, just up the trunk as much as is reasonable. Works very well. It keeps the heat in and the cold out. And that's all I have for this part of the presentation. I think I'm going to turn it over to Andra.
All right. Let me share my slides again. First of all, I want to say thank you, Nick. That was excellent. I think we all can say we learned a lot of valuable information from that. I think the bottom line of freeze protection practices for citrus is as long as we have healthy, well-managed trees, we can probably withstand cold temperatures and recover from damage more rapidly. But we have to be aware that saving that graft is paramount. So before we adjourn this evening, I want to talk about some other winter or early spring activities that we need to do for our fruit trees. After all, this is winter care for our fruit trees along the Texas Gulf Coast. We're going to talk about citrus, peach, avocados, and pears, and pruning of these 4 types of trees. One thing that I'm not going to go over this entire table, but one thing that we need to be cognizant of is if you prune too early in the season, before your last frost, you stand the chance of freeze damage on all of your trees. Because when you prune, you stimulate new growth, and that new growth is tender. So just be aware that when you prune, it's very important that you expect it not to freeze. Another thing that I want to bring up is citrus and avocado trees like minimal pruning. Citrus doesn't like pruning at all, and avocados don't either. But sometimes you do have low branches, and sometimes you have dieback and limb breakage. So sometimes you have to cut off some limbs, but usually for citrus and avocados, you don't cut off that much. Peaches are a whole different story. You want to prune those as soon as the buds start to swell and show a bit of pink, but you're going to prune off about 40% of the tree canopy through strategic cuts. And we could have a whole Keep Pearland Beautiful presentation on just how to prune peach trees. So I'm not going to get too much into that this evening. And then pears, you want to prune when they're dormant, and you want to prune about 25% or less of the tree canopy. Fertilizing fruit trees. Again, citrus 3 times a year, Valentine's, Mother's Day, and Father's Day as a general rule. And this is how much you want to fertilize, how many cups, and with what. Whenever you do fertilize. Avocados, same thing. You use an ammonium sulfate fertilizer with the 21-00 NPK, And this is your schedule over here, and this is how much here. And one thing I want to mention is if you have, if you look on your fertilizer and it says, apply this amount on a per year basis, what you want to do is figure out how many times you're going to fertilize that tree and divide that amount by however many times you're going to fertilize the tree. And then peaches, the same thing. Over here, how much is how much you're going to apply and with what in this column. Pears, the same thing. Avocados.
Hey,
The main
Andrew.
thing that I want to talk about on this slide is that there are 3 types of avocados. Mexican avocados are your most freeze resistant. They can withstand temperatures down in the 20s. So if you're interested in your avocado trees surviving freezes, get the Mexican varieties. Pest control. Peach trees need to be sprayed. They attract pests. What you want to do is spray them during the winter, essentially when the day, on a day when the air temperature is above freezing and the air is still. And on any pesticide, read the label. It tells you what to do and how to do it. Pears. These are the type of pests that you can get on pear trees. And what you want to do there is spray a dormant oil during the late winter or early spring while the tree is dormant. So this concludes, oh, before I forget, Nick has something to say, I'm sorry, Nick, about spraying citrus trees for pests.
I had to take myself off of mute. Yeah, there's a couple of different approaches for spraying citrus. They get leaf miner and whiteflies, and they can be severe if left untreated. There is an organic treatment that is effective, but needs to be constantly redone. And so it's called spinosad. It's can be found in most of your home garden nurseries. It's very effective. The challenge I find that if you apply it as frequently as the label, only as frequently as the label allows, then you end up with whiteflies and leaf miner. It's just, it only allows you to do so much. If you apply it more often, you take the risk of building up an intolerance in those bugs for that pesticide. So it's very safe, it's very useful, but you need to apply it more often than you're really allowed to apply it. There is a new one on the market called imidacloprid. That one is actually used in most of the commercial production facilities, from what I'm told. It is also used in our own nurseries here because the nurseries have requirements to use these pesticides to keep the trees in good shape and not promote growth of bugs. And the imidacloprid is something I haven't personally tried yet. I do plan on trying it this year. You'd have to read about it like I have. And I've decided that the contamination that comes is what I'm already getting every time I go to the grocery store, and that it is very minimal. And I'm going to be trying it, but I won't speak to it from my experience because I haven't used it yet myself. Those are the 2 recommendations. You can also use some sort of neem oil as another technique, as an alternative. But again, the frequency with which you apply it just doesn't seem to get all the bugs when you apply them. That's my summary, Andre. I hope that helps.
Indeed it does, Nick. Thank you very much. This concludes our winter care for fruit trees along the Texas Gulf Coast presentation. We're opening the floor for any questions anyone has. And before we adjourn, I'd like to say, Nick and I would like to say thank you and happy holidays.
One more comment on the this pesticides for citrus, and that is that if you're using the imidacloprid, you need to use it in the spring just after the blooming cycle because it can affect bees. And if you use it only after the blooming cycle, then it'll effectively have we'll say run out of its effectiveness by the time the next blooming cycle gets. If you spray them right before the blooming cycle, you'll potentially kill a number of bees, and we try to protect the small animals that we depend so much on.
Thank you, Nick. So Emily,
So Andrew, we had got one question that came in while you all were talking, and that was in reference to your presentation, Andrew. You had some good slides that charts that talked about for different types of fruit trees, pruning and fertilization. Is there a resource on the web that you could point people to that would have that specific information?
yes, there is. Let me end my slideshow. There is, let me try to find it real quick.
While she's trying to find it, I'll say you can always look up this presentation in the on-demand version of it and look up that chart again.
Yeah,
There
we'll be
is-
providing we'll be providing a recording of this presentation, and it'll be stored out on the Keep Pearland Beautiful site for reference. Absolutely. Yes, Sandra.
This information came from our brochure on fruit trees that Kimberly revamped, was it last year or year before? And that information, I believe, is available to the public.
It is, and I know where it's at, and I'll drop the link into the chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kimberly is the county extension agent. If you ever have any questions, just call the extension agent and they'll point you to the right location.
All
Are there
right, thank
any-
y'all both. This was a great presentation.
Are there any other questions?
That's all that came through on the chat, and one that and to me. So I think that wraps it up. Emily, you there?
Yes. Okay. I guess we're finished for tonight. Thank you so much for presenting, and this will be a great one for people to go back and kind of watch and use as a guide. So
And did
thank
you
y'all.
post the link to the survey out on the chat?
Yes, I did pin it in the comments.
Okay, so there's a link to a survey that people can fill out, and it'll go back to Keep Pearland Beautiful, and we'll get any feedback people have.
Yes.
All right.
Okay. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.